Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the third day of the virtual Context and Episodic Memory Symposium. I was given the honor of introducing the conference. I don't know why I got to do that every day. Usually I just do it once at the beginning of the meeting, but since we're in virtual world, I guess I get to do it 3 times. But I don't know about the rest of you, but it feels like Groundhog Day every day during this period. So it's okay if I'm just saying the same thing every time. We have an exciting lineup again for day 3 of CEMS. We will be beginning momentarily with our first speaker, Geoff Ward from the University of Essex, followed by a discussion of his presentation by Gordon Logan from Vanderbilt University. Then we will have 2 shorter talks by Oded Bein at New York University and by Christoph Weidemann at Swansea and Columbia. And then there will be a short break. As before, those of you who've been here for the last 2 days know the drill. You can post your questions directly in the question box, and I will read out during the session that I'm hosting the questions that receive the most votes to the questioner. I won't try and bring people on stage the way I did the other day because there's too many potential technical glitches with that. Well, without further ado, welcome again to everyone out there all over the world attending CEMS. And I will now bring Geoff Ward from the University of Essex on stage to present his talk, which is entitled, do you have a screen share, Geoff? I guess we'll share Geoff's screen. His talk, I don't know if he changed the title, Positive Effects of Rehearsal in Short-Term, Long-Term, and Working Memory Tasks. Perfect. Okay, Geoff, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. My name's Geoff Ward. I'm from the University of Essex in UK, and this talk is in collaboration with Kathleen Cortis-Mack, Charlotte Doherty, and Nathaniel Knight, and Vanessa Loaitza. And it's entitled, as Mike says, Positive Effects of Rehearsal in Short-Term, Long-Term, and Working Memory Tasks. And here's the basic overview of today's talk. There's going to be a fairly lengthy introduction and background in which I want to make a case that rehearsal has a positive effect in free recall and serial recall. And as I'll explain, this latter claim that there's a positive effect of rehearsal and serial recall is currently very contentious. So there's an introduction and background, 2 experiments. One looking at a task called the complex span task, which is a variant of serial recall. We're going to use it using overt rehearsal, where we record what people say during the task. And a second experiment looking at the Brown-Peterson task, inspired by an early experiment by Hellier, looking at the effects of additional rehearsal and some summary and conclusions. Participants, as we know, often repeat earlier items to themselves during the presentation of later items. So you present people with a series of items to try and remember, and while they're looking at some items, afterwards they'll rehearse earlier items. But this idea of rehearsal is contentious, and quite what one's view of rehearsal is affected by what you think about why people forget, why forgetting occurs, how items are represented in memory and how their repetitions are represented in memory. That's an important factor. Why you think people have working memory limitations, because clearly they do, and the reasons for serial position effects. All these different factors affect why our reasoning and theorizing about rehearsal. But theorizing about rehearsal in serial recall, where you're trying to recall the items in exactly the same order as they were presented to you, this is particularly contentious. And according to current claims, the classic view out there is that rehearsal maintains items in order in serial recall. So in the UK, one of the most dominant theories in the last 30 or 40 or 50 years is the phonological loop theory of Baddeley and colleagues. And the idea is that you maintain items in a phonological representations, and those phonological representations decay away with time. But rehearsal can offset that forgetting due to trace decay. And similarly is the case in the leading model of complex span, the time-based resource sharing model of Barrier and colleagues. A second view is that rehearsal improves recall in serial recall. And this is my preferred position. I think there isn't much of a difference between serial recall and free recall, and many of us people at CEMS would probably agree that rehearsal improves performance in free recall. but perhaps not all of us. And thirdly, a more recent position is that there actually is no causal relationship at all between rehearsal and recall. And this is a third position. So as I've suggested, if we go through these positions one by one, the idea that rehearsal maintains items in order, this is true of the phonological loop count, and many theories of serial recall, but certainly not all, argue that rehearsal maintains items in a highly accessible state, close to their original initial level of activation, thereby offsetting forgetting due to trace decay. So it's certainly not the case that all theories of serial recall assume that forgetting is by trace decay, but those that do, like the Badley account, often assume that rehearsal offsets that trace decay. Here's the account of Barrier for complex span. In this task, you present items, list items here to try and remember in serial order. Here's list item 1, here's list item 2. But the difference of complex span is in between each of the items, there is a period of distracting activity, some processing tasks that you have to perform. Sometimes the processing tasks are relatively short, when they have a short processing time, during the time when you're paying attention to the distracting items, we can see that during the presentation of the item, you can see the memory strength of that item activates. But when your attention is taken away from focusing on the memoranda, but actually doing the processing task, you see there's trace decay. If there's sufficient period of time in between the items, there's an opportunity to regain that memory strength, to reactivate those strengths either through rehearsal or through a mechanism called attentional refreshing. And this can carry on. So in this particular schedule here with a low cognitive load, it's possible to maintain the items because the distractive activity occupies a small amount of time relative to the free time you have to maintain the items. But in other distracted tasks, this one has been designed to occupy a longer period of time. Now there is the decay has got sufficiently here. There isn't sufficient time in between the items to fully reactivate these items. So according to these phonological loop and these time-based resource sharing accounts, the best you can do with rehearsal really is to maintain the items in serial recall. And I want to contrast that with a second view, which is one which I favor, which is the idea that rehearsal does more than maintain items, it improves recall in serial recall, just like it does in free recall. So talking of free recall, I'm going to have a blast from the past and talk about some free recall data where I want to show that rehearsal increases recall in free recall. Here, participants are presented with lists of 10 or 20 or 30 words for free recall at a fairly slow rate of 3 seconds a word. They don't know when the list is going to stop. It could stop after 10 or 20 words, or of course after 30 words. And according to this our position here, we believe that rehearsals create multiple copies that are reordered and redistributed throughout the list. So here's the data, the serial position curves for Ward 2002. On the y-axis, we have the proportion correct. On this particular x-axis, we have the nominal serial position, the position in the experimenter's list. We can see there are primacy effects. We have a recall advantage for the first few items in the list. We have large recency effects, recall advantage for the last items in the list. Big list length effects. Here, 10-item lists are recalled better than 20-item lists, better than 30-item lists. List length affecting the primacy effects, having little effect on recency. If you look at which items are rehearsed more, so again, it's the nominal serial position, the list position in the list. Just like Runders found, we find that the early list items gets the most rehearsals. So it could be that these items have strengthened representations in long-term memory, but our preferred interpretation involves looking when these items were last rehearsed. Here I've taken the same data and I've replotted the data by its functional serial position. So this is this was first performed by Brodie and Murdoch. And here we have the items, again, proportion correct here on the y-axis. And here's performance plotted by when items were last rehearsed. So it's a functional serial position. You rank order the items by when the items were last rehearsed. These items were the items in the list which were rehearsed most recently. And as you can see, when you recency justify the data, you get these long and extended recency effects. So in summary, I want to say that rehearsals improve performance, they improve your recall, the rehearsals create multiple copies that are reordered and redistributed throughout the lists, and recall increases with the number, recency, and distribution of these rehearsals. So we took that to serial recall sometime later in Tan and Ward 2008. We did immediate serial recall using overt rehearsal, and we presented participants with 6 words at a fast, medium, slow rate. Here are the serial positions. So here you're presenting participants with 6 words. They have to record them in the same order as they were presented. It's serial recall, and this is proportion correct with serial recall scoring. So this is how well you remember the first item when saying it first. You get the characteristic extended primacy effects now in serial recall with a hint of one item recency. Note that with ISR at fast rate of 1 word every second, that actually when we record the rehearsals, there's hardly any rehearsal other than saying the items as presented. It's a fixed rehearsal. And here, with no cumulative rehearsal whatsoever, you still get very decent serial recall performance. As you have a slower presentation rate, performance increases. Performance is better at a medium and then better still at a slow rate. And if you record all the rehearsals that people do, you find that people tend to rehearse in a cumulative forward order manner. They rehearse up to about the first 4 or so items. And if you plot the data for individuals, how well they perform on serial recall by the maximum sequence length, by how much cumulative forward order rehearsal they do, you can find a positive correlation. So we argue in Tan and Ward that rehearsal improves recall. This is serial recall. At fast rates, we note there's no rehearsal, but you still get very good ISR performance. So rehearsal is not needed for serial recall, but at slower rates, there's much more opportunity to rehearse, and participants choose to rehearse 4 words or so in cumulative forward order, and participants who recall more tend to rehearse longer sequences. But there's a third position, a fairly recent position, that there's no causal relationship between rehearsal and recall. So Lewandowski and Oberauer review all the evidence for up to date for there being evidence for a positive effective rehearsal on serial recall, and they say that there are lots of different ways of arguing away prior claims. More importantly, they argue that that rehearsal is error prone and recall is error prone. And so you might very reasonably argue that if you were to continually rehearse using an error-prone system, then rehearsal is just going to compound the order errors in serial recall tasks. And experimentally, recently, Sousa and Oberauer in 2018 replicated, this is in cognitive psychology, replicated the Tan and Ward findings I just showed you using fast rates and slow rates. They get exactly the same findings as we did, a very nice replication. But what they also did is they added a third condition called slow C in their condition, in their experiments. And here is, instead of asking people, allowing participants to rehearse however they like in overt rehearsal at a slow rate like we did in the slow rates, they encourage participants or instruct participants to rehearse at their maximum rate during serial recall. So they're told, try and rehearse as fast as you can, and they're given some practice at doing this. What they find is that participants who have these slow C instructions, it really does increase the amount of rehearsals and indeed the amount of cumulative forward order rehearsals, but critically, slow C instructions didn't increase their accuracy. Further evidence, they would argue that there is no causal relationship between rehearsal and recall. So what does rehearsal do? Does it merely maintain items? Does it improve later recall, or is it not very effective? So the first experiment looks at complex span. Here we present participants with lists of between 1 and 6 words. They never know when the list is going to stop for spoken serial recall. Here's what happens. You have a fixation cross. A word appears, 500 milliseconds on, 500 milliseconds off. Then there are 4 location judgments. Simple, really simple tasks. Is the square above or below fixation? 4 of those. And this goes round between 1 and 6 words, and then spoken serial recall of the words. So this is a complex span task. You may or may not know what the serial position curves look like on a complex span task, but they look pretty similar to serial recall. For a 1-item list, it's always good to note that University of Essex students can almost always remember 1 item in correct serial order. Not perfectly though, that's a bit of a problem. 2-item lists, you're pretty good at 1 and 2 here, but as soon as you get to 3-item lists and 4-item lists, and by the time you get to 5-item lists, you're getting this characteristic extended primacy with a hint of recency, and 6-item lists here. This is in the silent rehearsal group. The overt rehearsal group, where we ask people to rehearse out loud and record their rehearsals, the data, the serial position data, look pretty similar. There's no significant differences between these, extended primacy, and maybe a hint of one item recency for the list length 6 here. But what are they rehearsing? We've recorded all their overt rehearsals. What are they rehearsing? Well, here, just like in Tan and Moore, this is for list length 5 here, and for list length 6 here, we're plotting. If we concentrate on maybe the list length 6, we concentrate on here. We have a proportion correct using serial recall scoring, and how long the maximum length of sequences were. So these are different participants, people who rehearse right the way to the end of the list, or almost entirely. They're doing really well in serial recall, whereas people who don't rehearse very long sequences at all, they're doing less well. We always find there's a couple of individuals or a small proportion of individuals who don't seem to engage in rehearsals, and we never know quite what to do with these. Sometimes people like this, maybe we think they're not rehearsing very much, and maybe that's where their position should be. People like this, we like to sometimes think maybe they are rehearsing, but they don't like to say it out loud, but we just can't tell. So one thing you can do is either include all the data, because you just can't tell, fairly positive rehearsals, correlations rather. If you were to exclude these potentially awkward individuals, the correlation pretty much improves or stays the same. So we want to say that in this complex span, we have a positive relationship between rehearsal and recall. This is a serial recall task. Participants who choose or are able to rehearse longer sequences recall more. But of course, correlation doesn't equate to causation. To do that, we actually have to introduce some additional rehearsals. And here, we're inspired by an early experiment by Hellier. In this task, we gave 32 participants. They read aloud sequences of 3 words in a Brown-Peterson task. So the words will appear here one by one: boy, tin, corn, 1 word a second. And then participants are either this is blank, or participants see repeats of these items at a faster rate: boy, tin, corn, and they have to say the items as they appear on the screen. These are repeating the items either once each, twice each, 4 times each, or 8 times each, or there are no repetitions. Finally, we have the classic 3-digit number for which you have to do some backwards counting. So in this case, 546, you subtract 3 continuously. Here is the data with no repetitions. This is the Brown-Peterson task, precipitous forgetting over about 18 seconds. This is with the Brown-Peterson scoring. So this is scoring all 3 items correct in the correct serial order. With just 1 repetition, 1 extra rehearsal, I would argue performance improves. Causal improvement with 2 repetitions, 4 repetitions, and 8 repetitions. As you're increasing the number of repetitions prior to the backwards counting, so performance is improving. And this occurs not just with Brown-Peterson scoring, where you're recalling 3 items correct in a row, but if you do the same thing with just standard serial recall scoring, where you're allowing part scoring for each item correct position, or free recall scoring even, you get the same findings. So increasing the number of repetitions increases performance. Now you could say that are these repetitions really rehearsals? Well, we were COVID stopped experiments. We've done the same experiment again, just like experiment 2, but asking people to just presenting instead of boy, tin, corn, where you're just repeating the items, you just have an arrow and you have to rehearse the items either out loud or covertly to yourself. It makes no difference. So this is still ongoing data collection, but it's clear that repetitions and rehearsals here are much the same. So increasing the number of repetitions or rehearsals improves Brown-Peterson tasks. Recall improves with overt and covert rehearsal, as well as rehearsing repetitions. And here are my 2 summary slides. The first is that I want to say that generally there are positive effects of rehearsal on recall across a wide range of recall tasks. There's a positive relationship in complex span. That's experiment 1 in the Brown-Peterson task. Experiment 2, I've shown you historic data in free recall and serial recall. And I want to say this consistency encourages theoretical integration between different recall tasks. I want to stress that rehearsals during a list is not necessary to perform recall. And I want to also say that encouraging, I acknowledge that the finding that encouraging greater rehearsal than participants would choose is not always helpful, or not helpful at all in Sousa and Oberauer's case. And they've looked at this in both serial recall in 2018 and indeed in complex span in 2020. But how can these results be explained in a final slide? Well, one interpretation is that rehearsal uses the very same mechanisms as those used in retrieval. So here you can say, well, if rehearsals are simply retrievals, then rehearsals can improve recall through retrieval practice and distributed repetitions. Serial rehearsal and serial recall are both error-prone, just as Lewandowski and Oberauer claim, for longer sequences. So maybe what you want to do is choose to rehearse a short sequence with your subspanties. You can maintain that pretty much perfectly. You might think, oh, this is strange. If retrievals and rehearsals are the same, we know in free recall there tends to be recency-based recall, but rehearsals tend to be forwards order. How can this be? Well, in recent work suggests that retrievals of shortlists in free recall are in forwards order. If I say to you, recall in any order you like, fish, hat, bath, pot, there's a tendency, I think, for you to recall fish, hat, bath, pot. Even though you can record in any order, you tend to recall a shortlist for free recall in serial order. Rehearsals do show characteristic serial position curves. So that's another tendency, that rehearsals and recalls are very similar and show contiguity effects. And finally, if rehearsals are simply retrievals, my final point, then you can extend rehearsal to any retrievable items. It means you can imagine thinking of rehearsal of non-verbal items, like dots on the screen, and it's also the case that retrieval, well, that's not a contentious term. So although it might be contentious to talk about rehearsal being retrieval, you kind of lose some of the magic of what's going on, the mystery of what a rehearsal is. And then I'll leave it there. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
That was terrific. Great to see all those issues. Oded Bein, who is at New York University. Hi, Oded. We cannot hear you, or at least I cannot hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Better now?
A little better. A little better.
Sorry for that.
Now we cannot hear you at all. It's just quiet. Do you want to try again, Oded? See if it... Hello? We think you are muted, Oded. We think you are muted. I do not have the power to unmute you. I can mute myself. So there is a button. There's a button on the top of my picture that says toggle mute. I assume you've done that. Okay. We did have it working before. Okay, we're going to try to figure this out in the background. And in the meantime, I just want to say that relative to the early days of PowerPoint presentations, when there were even more challenges with technology than there has been in the move to online presentations, I think we've been doing pretty well so far. I remember when we transitioned from overheads, transparencies that you would put on your overhead projector. Then the only problem was that sometimes the lamp would burn out and could create a difficult situation when there were no lamps, and then you have your overhead transparency. Oded, you want to say something?
Can you hear me now?
Perfect. Excellent.
Yay.
Okay.
Sorry for that, everybody.
Yeah. Take it away.
Okay, now let's see if the share the screen thing will work. That's another challenge to overcome here. Can you all see my slide?
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
go through it quickly because we're running a little bit short. So take it
away. Okay. So thank you, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. And I want to thank you all for being here and for the organizers. And I'm just going to start. So I'm interested in how do we learn the structure of our everyday life experiences. And for today's talk, I mostly mean that our daily routine is composed of a series of events that repeat themselves. For example, every morning I wake up, I have my oatmeal for breakfast. Then let's talk about pre-pandemic times. I go up on the train and I end up in the lovely campus of Columbia University. Two key features of these events are that they have different contexts, like my house versus the subway, and they unfold in time. They happen one after the other. And also within events, for example, in the subway event, things unfold in time. I typically go on and find my seat and then have coffee, and then I read a bit of my book. Through repetition, we learn the structure of our everyday life events. We come to represent them based on contextual and temporal information. The hippocampus, we know, is important for learning and remembering events, potentially due to its role in representing context and temporal or sequential information. However, the hippocampus is a heterogeneous structure. Here you see the rodent and the human hippocampus, including the regions we'll focus on today, dentate gyrus, or DG, and CA3. DG versus CA3 are thought to mediate different functions. DG is thought to allocate distinct representations to similar stimuli, that is pattern separation. CA3 may pattern complete similar inputs into even more similar activity patterns, and I will say more about that later. So here we used high-resolution fMRI to distinguish between DG and CA3. We asked how do DG versus CA3 representations unfold in time during events, and how do these representations change with learning? And to answer these questions, we had people learn repeating events. Participants saw black and white objects presented sequentially and superimposed on colored backgrounds. For each object, they made a pleasantness judgment on the object color combination. Critically, every 4 objects, we changed the background color, effectively creating different events. So here you see 2 events, but each list had 6 of them. And we also instructed participants to make stories linking the objects together, but obviously we didn't give any instructions about the change of color. Then we simply repeated each list 5 times, identical repetition. Participants saw the entire list of 6 events, exactly the same order of events, same order of items, and then immediately saw exactly the same list again and again and again, 5 times. And when I turn to the behavioral data, behavioral signatures of event segmentation have included longer reaction times to boundary items, the first item in an event, compared to items within events. Indeed, we see longer reaction times for the boundary item, and that boundary RT effect is maintained across learning. And this is consistent with previous studies that only presented events once. So longer RTs at the boundary is usually considered as some cost to transitioning between events, a marker of event segmentation. Okay, in behavior, we have evidence that participants segment repeating events. When we turn to the neural data, I want to emphasize that, like my subway example, events share the same context and they unfold in time. We asked how do CA3 versus DG integrate or separate information based on shared context and time. And I'll start with CA3. CA3 neurons are highly interconnected and form an auto-associative network. And that was previously suggested to promote attractor dynamics. Similar inputs might pattern complete to the same activity pattern, whereas different inputs might attract CA3 activation to different patterns. We wanted to ask whether CA3 attractor dynamics might be influenced by event structure, potentially pattern completing within event, but separating different events. To illustrate, we asked whether CA3 may represent all of these items in the orange event similarly, and all of the items in the purple event similarly, but allocating different representations to each event. And this can be one way in which CA3 segments events as units or chunks. To address this question, we used representational similarity analysis. As participants were learning the list, we extracted for each item the activity pattern across all voxels in CA3. Then we compute Pearson's correlation, a measure of neural similarity between these patterns based on temporal gap and event. For example, these are all items that immediately followed each other, so zero gap, and they are also a part of the same event. And we also had zero gap across events. Exactly the same temporal distance, only that these items span across two different contexts or different events. So all of these items are items that are close in time. And we also had items that were farther in time, for example, with gaps of 1 or 2 items. So if C3 chunks together items based on events, items that are studied within the same event should show more similar representations compared to across events, and potentially irrespective of temporal gap. So I'm going to show you similarity values in the left CH3. On the y-axis, the difference in similarity from the first presentation. We subtracted the first presentation to control for correlations between patterns due to characteristics of the bold signal and processing steps, which is specifically important when we compare patterns across different temporal gaps. So we targeted in this study specifically the change due to learning. Temporal gap is on the x-axis, and we focused on the fifth repetition when lists were well learned. You can see here that by the end of learning, similarity within event in orange was higher than similarity across events in gray, and it is irrespective of gap, suggesting an event representation in CA3. Potentially, because of the auto-associative network in CA3, neurons from one item persist and are activated during the next item, and these become associated together and share similar representation. In the change of events, the external input is different enough to drive C3 towards a different group of neurons, and that resets the activity pattern, and then this new pattern persists through the event. So that is consistent with the tractor dynamics that I have mentioned earlier. And for the interest of time, I'm not going to show you, but this pattern is not strongly evident in the second repetition. It gets stronger with repetition. Next, we wanted to ask whether the strength of CA3 segmentation, the difference between similarity within event compared to across events, is this related to behavioral markers of segmentation? So is CA3 segmentation related to the difference in reaction time that we have seen between boundary and non-boundary items? Here, I'll show you on the x-axis, similarity within events minus across events. So larger values mean more difference between, more difference within versus across events, so more neural segmentation. On the y-axis, the RT boundary effect, with lower values mean less difference between the boundary and non-boundary items, or less cost to the boundary. We focused on repetition 5. And we see here that more CA3 segmentation led to less boundary cost, or to an easier transition between events. Potentially, if CA3 represents events efficiently, or the tractor dynamics separated event representations well, it facilitates behavior. It might be easier to shift between clear event representations and potentially to upload the next event model. Okay, I'll turn to dentate gyrus. Dentate gyrus is thought to support pattern separation, the allocation of distinct representations to similar inputs, similar stimuli. If you put rodents in similar environments, the activity patterns in DG will still be different, suggesting that pattern separation took place. And while these studies and others looked mostly at perceptual similarity, whether DG pattern separates also in time and whether temporal pattern separation is sensitive to context is still unknown. So we took the same approach as in CA3, and we could examine how does DG separate items within versus across events and also closer or farther in time. So I'm going to show you similarity values in the left DG. We focused on the fifth repetition. And on the y-axis, the difference in similarity from the first presentation. Just to orient you, lower similarity values mean less similar or more differentiation. Temporal gap is on the x-axis. You can see here that within event in orange, items that are closest in time that had no gap between them are the most differentiated compared to items that were farther in time, gap of 1 and 2. We refer to this as temporal pattern separation. And across events, in gray, you don't see this. Items that do not share the same context are all pretty much the same. And I'm not going to show it, but we see nothing in the second repetition. The effect emerges with learning.
Oded, you should wrap up.
Okay, so I am wrapping up. I have shown you evidence that DG might perform temporal pattern separation that is specific to context. DG selectively separated items that are close in time and were experienced within the same event but not across events. This may allow fine-tuned and distinct representations of information within an event. And it may be consistent with the transient inhibitory mechanisms that are triggered by neural expectations, such that if a group of neurons is active for one item and it then becomes inactive for the next one, so that their patterns are different, but then the neurons recover and are available for the following item. Okay, so to summarize, we found different CA3 versus DG codes for learning events. CA3 shows higher similarity within events compared to across events, suggesting chunking of events. This efficient chunking further correlated with easier transitioning between events. DG, however, shows separation between items that are similar in time and share the same context, and that might support fine-grained representations within events. With that, I want to thank my advisor, Leila Davachi, Natalie Plotkin, my wonderful RA, now our lab manager that helped to prepare this study for the scanner, and the wonderful members of the Davachi lab, and of course, thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Oded, for a very interesting presentation. So I think if we have time for one question, if we have one, otherwise, any questions? We'll wait for a moment, see if one comes in. And in the meantime, we will let our next speaker get ready. Okay, I think given that we're late on time, Oded will.
Sounds good.
Oh, okay, wait, no, we got a question from Miriam Ali. Where were your ROIs across the entire long axis of the hippocampus? Did you examine anterior versus posterior dentate gyrus for differences in granularity of separation?
Yeah, I didn't examine it yet. The ROIs are not segmented in the posterior hippocampus, in the farther tail of the hippocampus, but they do for the rest of it. And when I looked at dividing this DG ROI to anterior versus more posterior parts, it gets really small. So I didn't want to run pattern analysis on 10 voxels or so. And I didn't do it yet.
Great. Okay. Thank you again, Oded.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Great job. Okay. Our next presentation is going to be by Christoph Weidemann. Christoph, do you want to share your slides? Oh, okay. I guess, all right. So Christoph, I'll let you get started.
All right, thanks very much. So when we when we study memory, the typical tasks usually have multiple elements. There's usually a testing phase, a study phase, and then there's some period to where the information that we learn needs to be retained. And then there's a testing phase where we assess memory performance. And when we do assess memory performance, that performance is a joint function of all the cognitive processes that occur during these different stages of the experiment. And that's a particular challenge when we try to study the individual cognitive processes, for example, that allow us to encode stimuli. Because, in a free recall experiment, for example, and that's what I'll be focusing on today, the successful recall of an item depends on successful encoding, successful storage of that item, and then successful retrieval. And one way around this issue is to look at ongoing brain activity during the experiment and to relate that brain activity to subsequent performance. So, for example, if you want to study encoding processes, we can look at brain activity as they occur during the study of individual items, and then relate that brain activity to the memory performance. So in the free recall task we can study that brain activity as a function of the subsequent recall. And this is known as the subsequent memory effect. And there's lots of ways to record this brain activity. In this study that I'm focusing on today, we'll be looking at scalp EEG. And the way I'll be analyzing this data, so if you have a time series that looks like this, from an individual electrode, for example, I'll be decomposing that signal into power and different frequencies, and it's just illustrated here. I'll just look at how much power there is in these different frequencies. So concretely for study list, this is what this might look like. So what I'm illustrating here is just the beginning of a study list. The lists are 24 items in length in the study that I'm presenting here. Here's just the first 3 items. So these are the items here I've highlighted in bold. If an item was subsequently recalled, so the first 3 items here were judge star actor, and judge and actor were subsequently recalled. And the associated brain activity is just illustrated below. So time is on the x-axis, and power is on the y-axis here. And red colors indicate more power and that frequency at that time point, and blue colors indicate less power at that frequency and time point. And the vertical bar here just illustrates the onset of the item on the screen. And we can look at these patterns of brain activity as a function of subsequent recall. And when we do this, and we just average all the recalled items and non-recalled items, this is what this looks like. So we just can stack up all the unrecalled items, all the recalled items. You can see there's a difference in the brain activity as a function of subsequent recall. And this is the subsequent memory effect. And what you can also see is that this difference is quite sustained. There doesn't seem to be much happening in terms of temporal dynamics. It's a long-ranging effect. And so from now on, I'll be just averaging across a time dimension, and specifically across 300 milliseconds to 1600 milliseconds in this time window from the onset of the item. And this will be shown just by these figures here, where this is just the average time. We're just looking at power at the different frequencies here. So when we study subsequent memory effects like this, it's tempting to conclude that these must be reflective of encoding processes and give us insights into what's happening at encoding. But one issue with this interpretation is that that we don't have direct experimental control over whether individual items are subsequently recalled or not. And we know that there's lots of external variables that also affect the probability that an item will be recalled. So an obvious example is serial position. So this is the data from the experiment that I'm presenting here today, where, as I mentioned, we have 24 list items here, and I'm plotting the probability of recalling each item as a function of its serial position in that list. And you can see that an item is much more likely to be recalled if it's presented early in the list than if it's presented later in the list. And just like we can analyze brain activity as a function of subsequent recall, we can also just analyze brain activity as a function of the item's serial position. When we do this, this is what this looks like. And you can see that the brain activity for items presented early in the list looks quite different from the brain activity for items presented later in the list. And we can compare that to the subsequent memory effect that I showed earlier. So this is the exact the exact data that I showed in a previous slide. And we can see that the recall, just looking at the brain activity for all recalled items, they look very much like brain activity from early list items, and the brain activity from unrecalled items looks much like brain activity from later list items. And we can study this serial position effect on brain activity also independent of subsequent recall by just looking at serial position only for subsequently recalled items. Let's see. So this is now the same analysis, but only looking at subsequently recalled items. And you can see this effect still holds. It's even for subsequent recall items, later serial position look different. And the same is true for unrecalled items. We can see the same gradient for items that are not subsequently recalled. And obviously, serial position is just one of many external factors that might be affecting both brain activity and the probability of recalling an item. And so the goal here of this study is to try to disentangle these effects and to try to understand to what extent serial position effects reflect endogenous variability that's related to encoding success, or instead external factors that are already that are also predictive of recall performance. So to start off, I'm defining a multivariate version of the subsequent memory effect, because we have lots of neural data, we have lots of electrodes, we have power on different frequencies, and we want to combine all this data to predict the probability of recall for individual items. And I'm doing this here just with a simple logistic regression. So I'm using all this brain activity to predict the probability of recall for individual items. And then we can quantify that that multivariate subsequent memory effect by just computing the correlation between the recall status of the item and the output of that model. So this is a point-by-zero correlation because recall status is a binary variable. And when we plot this correlation, we can see that it's above zero, significantly different from zero, and this is our multivariate subsequent memory effect. So the reason we're doing this unconventional way of quantifying this subsequent memory effect is because now we can compare this effect with a corrected subsequent memory effect, where we try to statistically account for effects of external variables. And so the way I'm doing this here is by instead of using brain activity to predict the probability of the recall for individual items, I'm now using a list of external factors to predict recall, the probability of recall. And specifically, I'm using the recallability of individual items. This study is based on a large data set. We have 97 subjects who participated in up to 23 sessions each. And so we have a large data set where for each item that's presented to the subjects, we can estimate how likely it is to be recalled. And then obviously we can look at serial position of the item, and then we can also look at the list number within the session. So this could reflect practice effect or interference effect, and also session number, which also could reflect practice effects or anything else that might affect the recallability on a given day that you're participating in the experiment. So this is the first step of this way to get at a corrected subsequent memory effect. The second step then is to use the residuals from this model as our corrected measure of recall performance and predict that residual with brain activity. So instead of thinking of residuals as noise, here we're thinking of this as a corrected measure of recall performance that's stripped of all the effects of these external factors. And then we're using brain activity now to predict this residual level of recall performance. And then as before, we can just look at the correlation between residual recall performance and the output of this model, and compare that to our uncorrected subsequent memory effect. And we can
1 minute.
1 minute. Oh, that was fast. Okay, then so we can see that the correlation is slightly lower, and but still very substantial. So I'm going to speed up a little bit. We can also look at this. We can also aggregate across individual items if you want to get rid of effects of individual list items by doing a list level analysis. I'm going to skip this bit. So instead of predicting recall performance for individual items, we're predicting the proportion of recalled items across entire lists, and again, we can just do this with a regression model. We can calculate the correlation between the output of that model and list level recall performance and get our list level subsequent memory effect. And there, when we aggregate across lists, we obviously get rid of things like serial position, but we still have other external factors that might be affecting list level recall performance. And so this is the average recallability, the list number, and the session number. And we can again correct this list level subsequent memory effect the same way. We can by estimating the proportion of recalled items based on these external factors, and then using brain activity to predict the visual recall performance, calculate the correlation. And when we see this again, we only see a slight decrease in our subsequent memory effect here compared to the uncorrected subsequent memory effect. So to conclude, we see substantial item and list level subsequent memory effects even after accounting for external factors. We only see relatively small effects of external factors on the subsequent memory effect, and from that, we can conclude that subsequent memory effects largely reflect endogenous variability associated with cognitive function instead of these effects of these external factors that predict recall performance. So that's it. Thank you very much. The paper was just accepted a few days ago at JPLMC, and it's available on my website. Thank you.
Thank you, Christoph. Okay. I guess I shouldn't ask questions because I should know something about this.
Yeah, I should have acknowledged this is joint work with Mike.
You did all the work, but in any case, we have a couple minutes for questions, and then we will have a short break before the next session begins. So I'm seeing lots of applause coming through on the chat box, and for one quick question. Gordon,
everyone's ready for the break.
Okay, we have a question from Gordon Logan. Couldn't item effects also be endogenous factors?
Well, I mean, so I think that's a bit of a semantic question of what you call endogenous. We used to pretty liberal definition for external factors, so anything that we could pin to something that we could measure outside of the brain activity, we call it external factors. So, you might say, well, if an item is memorable, maybe that reflects something that's, endogenous to you or based on your experience or something. But if this is something, the way we measured item memorability was something that's memorable for across our subject pool. And so we labeled that an external factor. But yeah, so I guess it depends on your definition. We wanted to err on the side of labeling things as external to avoid that issue a little bit, to say what we
I think Gordon provides a correction that he meant external factors. Couldn't item effects also be external factors? And I think you're saying yes.
Yes, but I think that's how we. I mean, for example, the memorability of an item was in our model was an external factor. Where it was presented in the list was an external factor. I'm not sure what other item effects you might be thinking about, but anything that anything like that we would consider external.
So, what is an endogenous factor, Christoph?
Right. I mean, you could think of attention being endogenous, or anything that's to do with encoding processes that you might think that, well, if you study an item, sometimes, or study a list of items, sometimes your performance will be better, sometimes it will be worse, and any processes that aren't linked to anything that we can measure externally, we would call that endogenous factors.
Okay, thank you very much, Christoph, and thank you to all of our speakers this morning. We'll take a short break, and I'd like us to reconvene on schedule at 12:25, so in 10 minutes. This is short, get a cup of coffee, bio break, whatever you need. There's going to be a very exciting or interesting presentation by Pedro Bordallo, and followed by a discussion at 12:25. So see you then. So long.